Hey, welcome to the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute with your host, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest, Alan Bishop. Hey, this channel is all about home distilling and legal distilling. If you've got questions, reach out to us in the comments below, social media, or via bishopshomegrown@gmail.com. And don't forget to check out thealchemistcabinet.com. Hey guys, Talking Head video back again. Promise that in the near future, once everything sort of settles down at Old Homestead, we get everything in place and we're in full production, I will start doing more videos from Old Homestead. But for now, if you're interested in what I am doing at Old Homestead Distillery, check out my social media where I've been sharing videos I've been making, what's been going on there on a fairly well daily basis. And you can kind of see some of the stuff we're working on. But we've laid down peach brandy, we've laid down what we call Newton Stewart Shine. Which is basically the Elise corn, which is a flint corn population from a cross of 150 different varieties at the sister line to Amanda Palmer, along with toasted oats, malted Elise, sugar and raisins, as well as a Newton Stewart yeast strain, and a really cool malolactic strain as well. We've laid down our Sunshine Spirits, two different types of that. And getting ready to start in on the flavored stuff probably tomorrow, doing some prototyping on that. We've done 2 batches of split brandy apple rye oat, but learned a valuable lesson on that I'll tell you about at some point in time. But probably the only 2 batches of apple rye oat I'm going to make ever at Old Homestead, because grain in when it comes to rye that's unconverted, so it's still starch, is a bad idea, even with a Bain Marie system. That's what I'll tell you. Raw rye, way too sticky. Becomes an entire issue. Learn a new thing the hard way, and not making that mistake again. But lots of cool stuff going to be coming around the corner here from Old Homestead Distillery, and as you guys know, I've been so busy with that, I've had a hard time keeping up with One Piece at a Time. I've been recording for If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything, our Paranormal 14 podcast, wherever you get your podcast, for season 5. I think we've laid down 10 episodes. Getting ready to start editing those. I've got a couple more I'm going to record. Take a little break from recording that so I can edit everything, do some of the exposition episodes I want to do, and we'll start releasing those sometime in the next week or 2 here, once I have time to edit 1 or 2 of them. So I am head first into, I'm having a hard time speaking again today. Long day, I've sweat a lot and it's stormed here. I've got a bad sinus headache, but I am head first into the new Distiller's Almanac for 2025. Laying that thing out, getting all the stuff in place for that, all the articles written, all the intro written, all the actual astrological stuff written up, as well as trying to collaborate with some other people to add to it like we did last year, I think this year. So obviously the Farmer's Almanac and the Old Farmer's Almanac, they do a pretty heavy weather bent prediction sort of thing, but since we do the If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything podcast, I'm very into the 14, supernatural, paranormal, as is my wife, Kim. I think we are going to, with maybe 3 or 4 other people, each individually lay out a tarot spread or a rune spread or whatever divination, maybe even dowsing, that each one of us wants to do on a 12-month cycle, to give people an idea of the coming year. And then it'll be nice too to see the differences between what any one of us thinks about what might happen, or what we predict could happen, or what the spirits are telling us or the universe is telling us could happen in the next 12 months. So I think that'll be our bent for the Distiller's Almanac, is instead of predicting the weather, we're going to predict the future to some degree. So as always, you can buy the 2 books, The Alchemist Cabinet Volume 1 and Volume 2, The Black Forest Method, over at thealchemistcabinet.com. And we really do appreciate your support there. The books do run a little bit behind here lately. It seems like Amazon's having a hard time keeping up with our orders. At some point, I'm probably going to look into a different publisher if I can find something that's comparable. But we'll deal with that when we get there. Just know that if you've ordered a book, as soon as we get it, I will sign it and it will be on its way to you. That is an absolute guarantee. So let's jump into some questions. So I feel like there should be another one here that didn't get printed off, but we'll get to that here in a minute. I know what it is. So from Nige. So, hey Alan, you said you wanted a question, so here's another for your consideration. For all my brown spirits, I've been doing double pot distillation, which I'm loving the results of. But in my early runs, I was starting a spirit run with an ABV in the pot of 40%, but found my offtake was hitting hearts in the high to mid 80% ABV. To correct this, I now dilute my bourbon and rye whiskeys to 20% for the spirit run and Irish whiskey at 30%, as this seems to directly affect offtake ABV. As for rum, I'm still trialing different numbers. I've tried to find documentation on what ABV most people use for pot still spirit runs, but mostly all I find is to keep it under 40% for safety. What ABV do you normally run in both your commercial distillery and home setup? Do you aim for a specific number or just a ballpark figure? I'm thinking that commercial distilleries must try to keep these numbers uniform from batch to batch to keep their product as similar as possible. Cheers for your insight, Wizard of Oz. So, great question, and the truth of the matter is I usually don't dilute mine down. I go off of whatever proof I got off the stripping run. For me, those do tend to be very consistent within products. Now, not across products, but within products. So let's say something like bourbon, you know, it might be 60 or 70 proof for your low wines. Maybe apple brandy might be 50, somewhere in there. But almost pretty well consistent, you know, within categories. But I do not add more water unless I need the extra volume to make up for, you know, being over half full in the still or being under half full in the still. You don't ever want to run like that when you're doing a spirit run. The main reason that I don't mess with that is because I can manipulate, obviously, temperatures through, you know, how fast I'm heating, etc. Whether or not I'm running an agitator, if I have agitation control, depending on how fast that agitator is going, the distillation will run faster or slower. And also, in a commercial distillery, you know, time is precious, so you don't want to be adding a lot more water to a run, specifically because you're adding more time to it, because that water acts as a buffer when you're heating up. Now, I'm sure there are some that do that, and I guarantee you, as you've noticed here with your stuff, that there is an effect to it. At home, I'd probably be more likely to experiment around with that, but it's not something I'd probably do in a commercial distillery unless I was looking for a specific type of esterification alongside an acid or something like that I was adding into the distillation. But no, great, fantastic question, and that's a deep cut right there, man. Thank you for that. I got another question from the Wizard of Oz as well. So, I have found a love for rye whiskey and have made a couple of batches now, such as George Washington's mash and another similar mash, but with higher percentage of corn, which I like but find quite different to commercial releases. The rye I use is 100% malted. Unmalted rye is not easy to find in my area. What flavor differences would you expect between using rye that's malted or unmalted, and what do you think most commercial distilleries would use? Is there a benefit to using some of each in a mash? Is George Washington's rye meant to be made with malted rye? Another great question. So I can tell you that at Mount Vernon, you know, I volunteer there a couple times a year usually. We don't use malted rye. It's raw rye, and the reason for that is because we have no actual record of malting rye at Mount Vernon. Secondarily, it's a very small amount of malt that goes into that particular mash bill at 5%. Now, they didn't have an actual mash bill. What they had is records of grain that was used at the distillery, and from that they extrapolated a mash bill. That's my understanding of it. Steve Bayshore, my good friend, could obviously speak much more truthfully to that than what I can, because he is the expert when it comes to that. But one thing we've discussed here on the channel, and I don't mind discussing again, is that rye itself, raw rye, certain varieties anyways, even without malting, have a good amount of diastatic power and can convert without malting, which is pretty cool. Now, it's fairly low, but it is effective to some degree, and a lot of the old distilling literature mentions this, that you don't need to malt rye in order to get the effect out of it, especially if you're in warm weather, essentially is what the old books say. Now, what that has to do with it, I've never been able to correlate. I don't know for sure. I also do know that rye has a tendency oftentimes to partially germinate in the field before it's harvested, and so what you might be considering raw rye is actually at least partially malted. Now, all that being said, I love malted rye. My favorite whiskey of all time, period, and I have drank my fair share of it, is actually a Limestone Branch limited release. So for a few years, Limestone Branch did these cool limited release barrels. They were 15 gallons, and they did these as basically single barrels for accounts that didn't want to take an entire barrel, like restaurants and things like that, little bourbon clubs, you know, that don't want a 53 gallon, but a 15 gallon fits the bill. And they made several mash bills that they only did in these 15 gallon barrels. One of the mash bills was 100% malted rye, and it is a gorgeous whiskey that I am incredibly sad they're no longer producing. I do have the recipe for it. I did recreate it and put it in a bad mo. We'll see how it turns out in a couple years. I guarantee you that it will not be nearly enough to satiate my desire for that particular whiskey, and I will have to make quite a bit more if I can match the profile. But malted rye, and not just that product from Limestone Branch, but across the board with all the ones I've had on my podcast, Distillers Talk, or all the ones that people have shared with me, to me, where rye can go, you know, blood plum, it can go somewhat black cherry. Sometimes certain varieties can go dill or anise sort of thing, more herbal, even horehound candy or mint-like. Malted rye almost always has this distinct sort of, you know, those little gummy peach candy rings, sort of that flavor, or the flavor of biting into a peach, that area that's right between the skin and the actual flesh of the fruit. For me, malted rye brings that way to the forefront, and I absolutely love that characteristic. If I had to pick one whiskey to drink for the rest of my life, drink no other whiskey other than that, it would have been that Limestone Branch malted rye. So I think that you could do some really cool things with the George Washington mash bill if you switched out the raw rye for malted rye and found a corn that might represent some of the better qualitative elements of rye, in terms of the amino acids and the flavors that come across during distillation and the aromas that come across during distillation. Amanda Palmer comes to mind because there's a lot of stone fruit sort of flavors in Amanda Palmer, but it's also a little sweeter than what rye tends to be. So malted rye, Amanda Palmer, and then you know, your choice of whatever that last 5% is, either malted barley or maybe even just throw raw rye in for the 5%. Do a little inversion on that mash bill. Could be a lot of fun. So all right, so one more question here. I think I can fit it into one video. We'll just give you a little bit of a deluxe video. Instead of 10 minutes, we'll go a little over. So this is from my brother JJ Jackson from Moonshiners, Master Distiller. JJ, by the way, for those of you who are not aware of him, do not know him or never met him, not only is a great person and a veteran, but he's also one of the best young distillers in the United States as far as I'm concerned. Dude really knows what the fuck he's talking about. He's really passionate about this. He loves it. He understands that it's more than just making a commercial product. It's more than just being on TV. I can't say enough good about the dude. But that being said, he asked me a question, maybe for the YouTubes. Can you call it brandy as per the TTB if you use a thumper and add fresh fruit to the thumper during distillation? This is a great question. So there are a lot of very strange TTB rules. JJ and I just recently had a conversation sort of parallel to this about this weird rule that the TTB has that if you're making brandy and you are a legal distiller and you make the wine for the brandy in your distillery, you cannot capitalize or add sugar or any kind of, you know, sweetener to it to raise the ABV in that wine to make brandy out of it and then call it brandy. It automatically becomes a distilled spirit specialty, which is a class of spirits that the TTB does because they have no other way to describe them or understand them officially. But if you're a distillery and you buy your wine to make brandy out of from a winery, the winery can add sugar to the wine as part of their process. You can then buy that wine, distill that wine, and make brandy out of it. Now, I'm not entirely a purist when it comes to the art of distillation, but I am a historian, and I can tell you this. It was incredibly common in the United States, or what became the United States as well, to capitalize fruit wines to make brandy, because otherwise you only end up with 2.5 to 5% alcohol on things like pears or apples. Even peaches can be incredibly low. Often here in Indiana, it wasn't looked down on to add some sorghum molasses or even potentially some maple syrup to bump your sugar. I don't know how soon and how early they started adding, you know, refined cane sugar to things, but I don't see a big difference there as far as I'm concerned. In terms of bumping your ABV, as long as that fruit flavor comes forward, I still consider that brandy, regardless of what I might have to call it legally, one way, shape, form, or the other, and I think most of the old timers would consider it the same. So when it comes to adding fruit to a thumper and calling it a brandy, I see nothing against it. I don't see I can't see where there would be a legal distinction between adding fruit to the thumper, which we do quite commonly at Old Homestead, and you know, we've also done this at Stolen Wolf Distillery for the Wolf and Wilson project with the rye whiskey, not a brandy, but with the rye whiskey. I don't see a distinction between adding fruit to the thumper in order to infuse more flavor, or running a mash that hasn't finished, so therefore you still have some of those sugars from the fruit left behind and some of those aromatics from the fruit left behind. To boot, there is also a rule, and I can't remember the exact percentage, but with brandy, rye, etc., you can add, it's like 2 to 3%, 2.5%, whatever, of harmless coloring or flavoring to the distillate and still meet that category. With rye, for example, you just couldn't call it straight rye or bottled and bond because it has had something added to it. But it is still technically a rye whiskey, would still technically be a brandy. So yeah, I don't see any reason why a fruit infusion, whether it's in a thumper or a gin basket or an inline thumper, any other device you can imagine, would not still qualify as a brandy. So now when it comes to TTV reviewers and recipes and all that stuff, you kind of unfortunately get what you get from those people, and they don't all know the rules, and they don't all understand distillation, and some of them are probably at the bottom of the heap when it comes to government agencies. So I guess it depends on who you get as a reviewer. What I will tell you is, if you turn that in a recipe or a formula, trick I've learned on formulas and on labels, turn that thing in 3 or 4 times the same way. Turn it in 3 or 4 times with alterations to it, with variations on what you might want to do, because guaranteed you're not getting the same reviewer twice, and no 2 reviewers are going to say the same thing about that formula or that recipe or that label. So there you go. All right, guys, as always, I appreciate you. If you got questions, reach out to me, bishopshomegrown@gmail.com. Check out thealchemistcabinet.com. You can also contact me on any of my social media, which I do not have memorized, and or the YouTube comments below. And check out If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything podcast and Distillers Talk podcast. And one of these days I'll get my shit together, get this distillery under control, and get back to being creative in those realms a little more commonly than I currently am. So, love y'all. Later.